Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'm pleased to make a contribution on the Jobmaker wage credit bill, which is effectively what we're debating today. And I'll ask people listening to parliamentary proceedings and on the net to remember these five numbers: 2.5 million, 1.5 million, 160,000, 20,000 and 17,000. They're five very important numbers that have guided my consideration of this legislation and my approach in this House. 2.5 million is the number of Australians who are out of work or in work but desperately need more hours. That is the highest number of underemployed Australians this country has ever seen, 2.5 million. 1.5 million is the number of people in this country currently in receipt of the Jobseeker payment, the old New Start. 160,000 is the number of people that this government predicts will be added to the unemployment queues by the end of Christmas. So we'll have almost 1.7 million Australians receiving the Jobseeker payment. 20,000 is the number of residents of Shortland that are in receipt of the Jobseeker payment, and 17,000 is the number of residents of Shortland in receipt of the JobKeeper payment. So 2.5 million, 1.5 million, 160,000, 20,000, 17,000. These are five critical numbers, and they point to the current weakness in the economy, the once-in-a-100-year recession, and the fact that the government is not doing all it can to get us out of it. An example of that is the 20,000 residents of Shortland that are on the Jobseeker payment. They have suffered a cut a few weeks back that pulled $6 million a fortnight out of the Shortland economy, $6 million a fortnight out of the Shortland economy. And Jobseeker will return to its unacceptable $40 a day on the 1st of January. So there'll be millions more put out of the Shortland economy then, and 20,000 Shortland residents will be returned to an unacceptable level of poverty. For the 17,000 Shortland residents on the JobKeeper payment, they saw the JobKeeper payment cut a few weeks ago as well, pulling another $15 million a fortnight out of our local economy. $15 million that could be keeping cafes, restaurants, local businesses afloat. And again, we have the JobKeeper cliff early next year, where we'll see that payment disappear. And those two payments disappearing, impacting incredibly negatively 37,000 residents of Shortland, is symbolic of the philosophy of this government, the philosophical approach of this government embodied in the budget delivered 2 weeks ago, which is really all about passing the baton of the recession response from the government to businesses and consumers, returning to this government's fundamental ideology of small government. They are putting this country into $1 trillion of net debt, $1.7 trillion of gross debt, and pumping that money into the economy through businesses and consumers in the hope that they will spend money to get us out of this once-in-a-100-years recession. And this is an incredibly risky philosophy. It's incredibly risky, and it's risky for a few reasons, Madam Deputy Speaker, and that's the context for the Jobmaker wage credit that we're debating today. Firstly, it's risky because businesses, first off, will not spend if they don't think they've got customers that will buy the products that investment will produce. They will not buy new capital equipment if they don't foresee a new stream of customers that will take advantage of that new piece of capital equipment. So businesses won't spend the investment allowance readily unless they're very optimistic about the state of the economy, and the latest business confidence figures released last week demonstrate that businesses are very gloomy about prospects for recovery. Secondly, the investment allowance is a very blunt instrument, Madam Deputy Speaker. The industries most impacted by the COVID recession are industries that are not capital intensive. The four of the five top employment categories that had the most significant job losses, these five categories had 50% of the job losses during the COVID recession. Number one is retail assistants. Number two is hospitality workers. Number three is retail and hospitality managers. Number four is personal service workers. Only number five is plant operators. So four of the five, the top four employment categories, are in industries that are not capital intensive. So having an investment allowance, as attractive as it may be to some businesses and as important as it will be to some businesses, that will encourage, for example, a metal manufacturer to spend $1 million on a new laser cutting machine. That's not really attractive to a cafe whose biggest capital investment might be a new coffee machine or a new pie cart or a new van delivering food. So a capital investment allowance is not the most sharpest, it's not the most focused way of getting businesses to spend money, even if you think businesses will spend money in the expectation that customers will buy. The second issue with this philosophical approach of the government is putting the money in the hands of consumers and hoping consumers will spend that money. Well, consumers quite naturally at this stage are very cautious. I am very cautious myself. When you've got an economy where you've got 2.5 million people out of work or desperately needing more hours, people are going to be very frugal. So tax cuts as embodied in this budget, a lot of those tax cuts are going to be saved. So there are real question marks, Madam Deputy Speaker, about whether this $1 trillion of debt we're going to be in because of this government spending will actually achieve the stated economic stimulus impact. So it's a very curious decision, Madam Deputy Speaker, to at the same time withdraw aggregate demand by cutting JobKeeper and JobSeeker, which is what this government is doing. And that's the context for the Jobmaker hiring credit that we're talking about now. A wage subsidy for those under 35. And look, this will obviously help get young people back into work if the detail comes as promised. And we do recognise that young people are impacted by the recession. They are in industries disproportionately impacted by the particular nature of this recession in terms of the industries that are cut down. But the issue with this legislation, Madam Deputy Speaker, is not who's included in it, it's who's excluded. 928,000 Australians are excluded from this wage subsidy. 2 in 3 JobSeeker recipients are excluded from this wage subsidy. Everyone aged over the age of 35 is excluded from this wage subsidy. And this leads to huge issues. Firstly, the biggest cohort, the single biggest cohort on JobSeeker are women aged over the age of 45. Aged over the age of 45. There is a huge cohort on JobSeeker of Australians aged over 45. So they are going to be massively disadvantaged when this wage credit gets passed by this parliament. Because if you're an employer and you're doing a job interview and you've got 2 people who hire and they might have equal skills and decent levels of experience, and one's 29 and you're going to get a $200 a week wage subsidy to hire the 29-year-old versus a 49-year-old person, who do you think they're going to hire, Madam Deputy Speaker? They're going to hire the 29-year-old, therefore excluding that 49-year-old. That's on top of issues around age discrimination that we know affect huge numbers of Australians aged over the age of 45 in this country. So the targeting of this wage subsidy is problematic. I support young people getting into jobs. It is desperately needed, all the assistance we can to help young people find new jobs. But it should not be at the expense of older Australians. So the question for the Prime Minister is, why exclude 928,000 Australians? Why hasn't he designed a system that gives a wage subsidy to hire every single unemployed Australian in this country? The second issue with this wage subsidy is that it provides a perverse incentive for an employer to sack someone aged over the age of 35, particularly if they're in an industry where they've got weakened industrial relations protections under this government. There's a huge perverse incentive for them to sack someone who's 37, hire a 29-year-old to do exactly the same job and pocket a $200 a week wage subsidy. Now, most employers won't do that. Most employers will do the right thing, but there are always dodgy employers, Madam Deputy Speaker, always dodgy employers that will do the wrong thing, and this has a perverse incentive. The other issue with the implementation of this is the way the legislation is constructed. An employer has a much greater incentive to hire 2 part-time workers than 1 full-time worker, because he or she gets a much greater wage subsidy per hour worked if you do it on a pro-rata basis. So again, while part-time employment is very important and it's attractive to many people in the economy, We should be encouraging full-time employment as much as possible. And that's why the way this is constructed is problematic. And it reinforces a huge issue this government has presided over, which is the rise of insecure work in this country, Madam Deputy Speaker. Last year was the first time in the economic history of this country where we had more than half of Australian workers performing jobs that weren't full-time with leave entitlements such as sick leave and paid annual leave. That points to huge economic insecurity in this country, points to huge issues around trying to take out a loan to buy a house or take a holiday, and this legislation reinforces that particular rise of economic insecurity. And the other issue with this legislation is the complete lack of detail. As previous Labor speakers have highlighted, this legislation is very light on detail. The government is effectively saying, trust us and we will deliver. Well, I don't trust this government. Time after time they've demonstrated their complete inability to manage the economy and to manage administration of government programs. They've overestimated the cost of Jobkeeper by $60 billion. They've bought a piece of land at Badgerys Creek for $33 million when it was worth $3 million. You've got the sports rorts affair. You've got issue after issue, highlight after highlight of this government maladministration. So trusting us is not an answer I feel comfortable with this government. So this legislation is incredibly problematic. It has some things going for it. It is useful. I certainly support anything we can do to help young people get into employment. We need to fight the scourge of unemployment. It is the greatest scourge in this land at the moment, Madam Deputy Speaker. We have 2.5 million people out of work or needing more hours in this country. There are 20,000 residents of Shortland on JobSeeker at the moment. We need to get them back to work. We need to get out of the once-in-a-century recession. We need to get out of a recession that this government, under the Prime Minister Scott Morrison, has deepened and lengthened because he was slow to act and is prematurely removing government stimulus. So this legislation is important, but we need to place it in context of this government continuing to mismanage the economy.